We had to negotiate between Mandela, Buthelezi, and de Klerk with Dr. Kissinger to try and bring a settlement, and the negotiations fell apart. And it was literally 2 weeks before the election. It felt like South Africa was literally on the brink of civil war. You would remember Rwanda at that particular moment, April 1994, exploded into a civil war and 1 million people were killed in no time. And South Africa's assessment was that there were enough arms buried between the various parties that if those arms were brought to bear at the time of the election, that would have brought about a civil war at the time. We negotiated an agreement within 48 hours that have brought the parties into an agreement that was everybody thought was impossible, but we managed at the last minute to bring everybody together literally 10 days before the election. I was newly married at the time. My wife was pregnant. I remember the overwhelming sense I had when the mediation failed and we were looking into the apocalypse. I sort of felt, a situation had arisen in which my daughter was going to be born into a country she didn't want to be part of because it was just going to be chaotic. I had a call from Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the lead negotiator and the general secretary of the ANC at the time. It was probably 1 a.m. in the morning to say, Colin, in your opinion, is this real or is this another wasteful moment where we're going to find that they're not serious? And I told him that they had no real alternative but to save the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of South Africans who would die if the election happened without an agreement. And they went to bat, and 2 days later, we signed the agreement in front of global press. People think of miracles as things that you don't understand. And I always explain that if you can explain something from A to Z, it's not a miracle. But if you can't explain or you don't have the time to explain it, it always appears as a miracle. So South Africans didn't understand it. They just thought it was a miracle. But it was through the hard work of a lot of people, leadership decisions that were taken at a critical moment that was quite frankly unlikely. If as a banker now looking back, I would say, what is the probability of that happening over that historical period? You would have to say the probability was extremely low. Yet we managed to make it happen.
Hi, my name is Imadi. Welcome to the channel. This is We Made It in America. Here we talk to immigrants who come from all over the world and build incredible success here in the United States. If you want to join, please subscribe, like, comment, share, and just be part of the conversation. Let's dive in. Colin is a distinguished South African banker, academic, and public statesman. He served as the Chief Executive Officer for Sub-Saharan Africa at Goldman Sachs until his retirement in 2019. And before that, he worked at JP Morgan and Standard Bank. From as far back as the 1980s, Colin was involved in bringing about the end of apartheid in South Africa and the country's transition back to democracy in 1994. Colin has been named a World Economic Forum Global Leader for Tomorrow. He's received Harvard Business School's Statesman Award, and he was listed in Euromoney's top 10 financing leaders for the 21st century. He's currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Before that, he's been at several top institutions around the world. He was a senior fellow at Yale, an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, and he was a distinguished fellow at INSEAD. Thank you so much, Colin, for your time and for being here.
Lovely to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me.
Start at the beginning of your journey, your story. You were born in South Africa at the time of apartheid and institutional racial segregation. You were born in a family of anti-apartheid activists. Your dad, he sold his business and went fully into activism. What was it like growing up at that time? Was it something you were consciously aware of, and how did you process being in that kind of system?
Yeah, thanks. It all sounds very impressive and interesting when you state it the way you have. As things go with life, things develop. They don't. You don't start in a particular place. I was born into a very abnormal society. It was a Christian national state that portended to present things as being in the Christian spirit, but essentially it was a brutal, racist societal structure. And the way it sort of played out was I was a young boy growing up in this abnormal society. We weren't really activists at the time that I was growing up as a young boy and then a teenager. I was a sports mad South African. I was a tennis player. It was only as things developed over time that, the apartheid structure sort of invaded our life. Because my brothers, as they grew up, I'm the youngest of four boys, became active in student politics. The repressive nature of South Africa at the time came into sharp relief, particularly when my brother was detained in 1981 by the security police for 6 months. The person in the cell opposite him was murdered after being severely tortured. That kind of experience when I was 18 dramatically changed our lives. We went from being, I would say, conscious, progressive thinking to becoming activists. So my whole family really engaged in anti-apartheid work and then ultimate human rights work and political activism. I became an architect, an architectural student in 1981 and spent 8 years at the campus. But while I was at the campus, Wits University, Johannesburg, the apartheid repression and student activism just accelerated. I became a student activist and a conscription activist because there was conscription into the South African Army. Then I actually became an underground activist in the African National Congress whilst I was doing activist work for the National Union of South African Students. So that was the environment that it was during my student days.
I was going to ask you about that because that's been a very public story, you know, of your brother Keith when he was detained in prison, and so it's important to know these stories, how your family's activism developed and became so prominent, and then from around 1989 to 1994, you were executive director of the consultative business movement. And one thing I really want to hear the story of, and I'm sure a lot of people do too, is at the time when you were about 31 years old, you participated in the negotiations that led to the democratic transition and the elections for South Africa in 1994. And you were helping broker those negotiations between people like Nelson Mandela, Henry Kissinger. What was that experience like at such a young age and a critical time?
We facilitated talks about important constitutional policy issues like federalism and the distribution of powers between what you would know in the US as states versus the federal government. Ultimately, interim constitution was agreed between the two main parties, the National Congress and the National Party, but there were a number of parties who were staying outside the negotiations and combining with force elements to attack the negotiation process because they didn't want a constitutional democratic setup. Election date was set for 1994. And so once the date was set, it was a clock ticking down to that date. And as the clock got closer to the date of the election, April 27, 1994, the parties became increasingly violent, increasingly conflicted. So we had to negotiate between the parties. The only thing the parties at that stage could agree on was international mediation. That was where Dr. Kissinger, Lord Carrington, and a number of parties came in. The mediation terms were questioned and effectively rejected. And then we had to negotiate between Mandela, Buthelezi, and de Klerk with Dr. Kissinger to try and bring a settlement. And that proved impossible. And the negotiations fell apart. And it was literally 2 weeks before the election. It felt like South Africa was literally on the brink of civil war. You would remember Rwanda at that particular moment, April 1994, exploded into a civil war and 1 million people were killed in no time. And South Africa's security assessment was that there were enough arms buried between the various parties that if those arms were brought to bear at the time of the election, that would have brought about a civil war at the time. We, myself and another one of the mediators by the name of Washington Kumu, facilitated an agreement with Buthelezi to bring him into the elections on condition of three things, basically that he would participate in the election. Two, that the sovereignty of the Zulu kingdom would be respected in the constitution. And thirdly, there'd be international mediation. And on that basic framework, we then went to negotiate. I arranged meetings with President Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, and we negotiated an agreement within 48 hours that if brought the parties into an agreement that was everybody thought was impossible, but we managed at the last minute to bring everybody together literally 10 days before the election. I must say my reflection is that most people from a left-wing perspective believe that masses make history and leaders, are effectively brought along by the masses. But I would say that experience was one witnessing Mandela, de Klerk, Buthelezi, that was only partly true. The conditions were there, created by this conditions on the ground, but the leadership, particularly Mandela and de Klerk, were able, in the heat of the moment, it would have been very natural for them to walk away. And in the heat of the moment, they were able to overcome some very important obstacles. And I remember very clearly the meeting we had with Mandela, which was the key meeting, followed an ANC rally where 3 people had been killed in a crowd crush. And Mandela had gone very upset to the hospital to see the victims and to speak to the families, and he'd come late to the meeting. He came from that chaotic environment into this meeting where we were talking about some obviously very complicated and very difficult things. And he came in and he focused very, very sharply on the key issues in the meeting with us and called to Clerk and very quickly came to the conclusion that this was an opportunity he couldn't walk away from. And when I got back to my home, because we'd flown to Cape Town, when I got back to my home, I had a call from Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the lead negotiator and the general secretary of the ANC at the time. It was probably 1 a.m. in the morning, to say, Colin, in your opinion, is this real, or is this another wasteful moment where we're going to find that they're not serious about a deal? And I told him that they had no real alternative but to save the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of South Africans who would die if the election happened without an agreement. And they went to bat, and 2 days later, we signed the agreement in front of global press. As everyone knows, that was followed by a peaceful election, largely peaceful. There were some incidents, but relative to what it could have been, it was a peaceful election. But people think of miracles as things that you don't understand. And I always explain that if you can explain something from A to Z, it's not a miracle. But if you can't explain, or you don't have the time to explain it, it always appears as a miracle. So South Africans didn't understand it. They just thought it was a miracle. But it was through the hard work of a lot of people, leadership, decisions that were taken at a critical moment that was quite frankly unlikely. If as a banker now looking back, I would say, what is the probability of that happening over that historical period? You would have to say the probability was extremely low. Yet we managed to make it happen.
That's incredible. I can't imagine how it must have been, like, the eyes of the world on you at that time, and then everything around you is falling apart, including other countries like Rwanda.
I was newly married at the time. My wife was pregnant. I remember the overwhelming sense I had when the mediation failed and we were looking into the apocalypse. I sort of felt, a situation had arisen in which my daughter was going to be born into a country she didn't want to be part of, because it was just going to be chaotic. So the elation of, a very personal level of, at 31 years old, knowing that the election is happening and there was going to be a democratic, peaceful transition was immense.
Amazing. Then in June of that year, just right after the elections in April, you were invited to serve on parliament, but you declined that. You went into banking, and that was when you joined Standard Bank Group. So I was just wondering, because it seems like, especially at that point, you definitely had passion, experience for public service. Why did you decline that and choose to go to the private sector at that time?
It actually happened in January. ANC and other parties announced their candidates for the election. If you vote for us in April 27, 1994, these are the people that will be representing our parties in Parliament. And in January, the ANC, headed by Mandela, announced their list, and I was on the list. In the end, they won 2/3 of the vote. And I would have been a parliamentarian if I'd stuck in. But I was in the middle of the negotiations, and I couldn't both be on a party list and be a non-partisan negotiator. So I decided to withdraw. The IFP, the Carter Freedom Party, also asked me to stand on their list later when I declined. But I was really an ANC person. But to your question more broadly, I did go through a process of thinking about it. My calculation was, as a white South African at the age of 31, and this was after talking to various people like Thabo Mbeki and Muhammad Vali Musa and a variety of people I regarded in the movement as highly respected. They all said to me, listen, you're too young. You should rather develop skills, develop financial independence, develop experience away from Parliament. You can always come back at a later point in time. And I thought to myself, with my closest friends, this was a time for African leadership in South Africa. So I thought, no, I shouldn't go into politics at that point in time. And neither, for that matter, should I go into government, because I was offered a variety of posts, including working in the National Treasury, which is the Ministry of Finance Department, and various other things. And then I was offered roles in this private sector because of the work I'd done with the business leaders in the negotiation. And my calculation was it was better to go into the financial sector, which was widely exposed to the economy, build my skills there, even though I didn't have technical expertise, and then use my networks and my strength and my access into the system to be useful to those entities whilst I learned the skills of the financial sector. And I chose to go into Standard Bank, which was offered me a role to be advisor to the chairman of Standard Bank in repositioning the bank for the new South Africa, and help to build the bank's business. So that was my calculation at the time.
To your point about the advice that you got about building skills first and then joining government. So now, obviously having definitely built those skills, would you today going to work in the public sector potentially?
You know, I've had opportunity to do that. I was asked by the president in 2018 to run his investment campaign as an advisor to the president. And I declined at that point in time because my feeling was that that role needed to have the powers of a cabinet position in order to be effective. So although you're an advisor to the president, I don't think you would have had the leverage with other cabinet ministers. Why do I say that? If you go and see the top 100 companies in the world, and you basically say to the top 100 companies, of which 50 are in the United States, 25 in China, the balance throughout the world, you go to them and say, look, please come and invest in South Africa. We will tailor a package of investment opportunities, trade, taxes, logistics, infrastructure, market access, a variety of things. Then you need immediately to go to those ministers and say, okay, I need some amendments on the tax side. I need some incentives. I need industrial trade zones. And you can't really do that effectively if you're not empowered significantly enough. So that was my calculation. So it's not something in principle I would not do.
Back to your story to 1997, that was when you moved to London to join JP Morgan as vice president and M&A team for energy, oil and gas. Then in the year 2000, you moved back again to Johannesburg. And that was when you started working at Goldman Sachs. At Goldman, at least from outside looking in, it looks like you had a very quick career progression. In the year 2000, 2002, you were named managing director. In 2008, you were head of Sub-Saharan Africa. 2010, you're a partner. So it does seem like you had that a very enviable career progression for banking. That's really quick. So what was your experience like now on the private sector side for a large institution heading up their African office? Then on the personal side, what helped you to be able to progress so well in your career there?
You must remember I joined Standard Bank when I was roughly 32, and I left and I joined Goldman Sachs when I was about 38. So that 6-year period between Standard Bank and JP Morgan, I would call it learning the ropes. I was doing a lot of work on infrastructure funding, municipal funding at Standard Bank. Then at JP Morgan, I was learning the ropes on M&A and global M&A, particularly on the utility energy space. So by the time I got to Goldman, I had filled the gaps on the technical side, gone from knowing nothing literally to running DCFs, valuation multiples. And so by the time I got to Goldman, I felt like I was on very solid ground. And Goldman took me back to South Africa to build their business. So they were taking me back into an environment where I knew the network extremely well. So I was a VP when I joined Goldman. You know, the writing was on the wall. I was running and building a franchise in a country 10,000 kilometers away from the center. You know, it was a question of my building that one person at a time. By the time I left, there were 50 people in the office. We had a full banking license and so on. But it was a huge journey over the 20 years, right, to get to that point in time. It sort of, makes it sound a more rapid rise than it was. But it was a very successful career. And, I think a place like Goldman, if you fit in and you really drive the engine, you're going to do well, and, you've got to differentiate yourself in banking. So in a place like Goldman, you're surrounded by brilliant people. Whether it's first year, 10 years, 20 years, people in the bank, they're all brilliant. They're all there because they're the best people in the world to be there at that point in time. Your ability to differentiate yourself, either a product excellent person, an industry person, a country person, developed market and emerging market person. I was firstly the South African coverage banker. Then I became an African coverage banker and manager. And at the same time, I was one of the key investment banking services, IBS coverage people throughout the region. And then my career evolved to me as I became, a global connector between our region and both developed and developing markets. I became very engaged in China, became very engaged in Brazil, in the UK, in Europe, and in the United States. And that has a lot of value. I think about 2011, I was one of the handful of leading emerging market bankers, what we call growth market bankers, led by a guy by Mike Evans, who was an Olympic gold medalist Canadian rower who led the emerging markets effort at Goldman Sachs. He's now president of Alibaba International. But what I'm trying to paint a picture of is it's very important to differentiate yourself and at the same time to grow your platform. And I did that, I think, relatively successfully.
Yeah, you did. And then you retired in 2019, 2020 from the firm. Yeah, since then, you've worked with so many institutions. I know right now you're with the Atlantic Council till next year. You've also worked with Yale, with Columbia, INSEAD, like we mentioned in the introduction. In that time, too, you've spoken at a lot of conferences, a lot of global media platforms, things like that. You're working on your new book. As someone who has seen the public sector side, the private sector side, both very intimately. And now you have more time to spread those ideas, distill them at these kinds of institutions and places. What's your vision for this phase of yourself, of your life's work?
Roughly the age of 18 to 31, I was very involved in the public space, in the space of shaping South Africa and its future. From the age of 32 until my retirement 5 years ago from Goldman, I was deeply engaged in the private sector, deeply engaged in Goldman, although I was using Goldman as a platform to influence what was going on. I was very highly involved in initiatives from the CEOs to effectively tame the worst of President Zuma and helped back the rise of President Ramaphosa and helped create initiatives like the Youth Employment Service, which I co-chair today, to create things that can have impact. And so in the post-Goldman period, at the end of 2019, I retired. These 5 years have really been about the vision, as you say, has been about closing the loop between the public experience and the private sector experience and having the greatest impact I can have away from transactions. I wanted to get away from a transactional environment of banking. Although I am on public boards, on private boards, on philanthropic boards, I invest, I consult, I'm still active in various forms and in academic institutions, but trying to bring the world of ideas, the world of impact, the world of institutional involvement and development all into as much of an impact as I can. Who knows where it'll lead? Things can develop from time to time that are not necessarily known today. So I'm open-minded about how it'll develop. But my vision is to have the greatest impact I can bringing together all of these strands. At this point in time, I'm now 62. So I would say, I've got probably 10, 15 years of high impact service left in my career.
I'm going to ask you a few topical questions about Africa generally. In the past, at least in the past 10 years, there was more optimism in the Africa Rising story about investing in Africa. And the whole thesis of that was always centered around things like population growth. In the past few years, there's been more skepticism, pessimism towards that. And people feel like they haven't seen the productivity or income that should match that. So right now, what do you think is the business case for investing in Africa? Africa?
I built the non-South Africa business from 2005 to 2020. In those 15 years through the cycle, I would say South Africa was at its minimum 80% of the contribution of the Sub-Saharan Africa business of Goldman Sachs. For the non-South Africa contribution of Africa to our revenues in the region, it was a 20% contribution. Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs at the time, used to describe, from a business point of view, Africa as an option for Goldman Sachs. I'm talking the whole region, including South Africa, because it's obvious that Africa, with effectively 4 in 10 people coming out of Africa by the year 2100, and so in 75 years' time, Africa is going to have to grow its share of GDP. There's no environment under which Africa will not rise. The GDP of Africa will not rise as a percentage of the global GDP. And therefore, proportionally, the contribution of the Sub-Saharan Africa business of Goldman Sachs should rise towards Goldman Sachs' total revenue accordingly, commensurately. The question is timing. At what point does Africa meet its potential? Are you, Imado, now talking at the right time of your career where it's about to now take off, or are you one generation too soon? And it's absolutely clear that the business I helped build in Africa for Goldman Sachs was a very valuable foundation. As a global bank, you need it, right? But at what point will it really rise, really take off? Go from a $500 million business to $1 billion to a $2 billion business? And that is the $1 million question. When you ask what are the components of the opportunities, it's obvious that the population explosion is going to feed consumer opportunities, fintech opportunities, infrastructure, industrial opportunities, and strategic minerals are going to be a very important point of extraction and processing for the global economy, given that roughly 1/3 of the strategic minerals in the world are from Africa. Obviously, the Chinese are very advanced in positioning themselves for that. The US is very much at the beginning, and one can detect with the Trump administration the beginnings of stirrings of trying to position US interests, particularly for strategic minerals. And the other $1 million question is it inevitable that Africa meets the requirements, minimum requirements to feed its population? It's probably not the case. In other words, it's not a necessary outcome. One of the points I've always made is that the global institutions need to be very careful that they need to help accelerate development in Africa such that the population of Africa, as it explodes, is able to get the resources needed. Otherwise, you will have mass migration into Europe, into the United States, and other parts of the world for Africans to look for opportunities to feed themselves, clothe themselves, give opportunities to their kids. And that could lead to a rise in reactionary politics in those countries that will bring about the rise of fascism in the world. Now, we're already seeing components of right-wing reaction in certain countries in the world, and migration is a very, very hot topic. I don't believe we've begun to see the rise of those effects yet. I think that it's very much at the beginning. So there's a potentially happy ending and there's a potentially very tragic fan of outcomes here, depending on what people do.
What do you think the diaspora can do? So people who have, at least for the short, medium, maybe long term, choosing to be abroad, how can this diaspora contribute to growth on ground?
I think that the best thing people can do is act in their own interest and be ruthless in their pursuit of opportunity for themselves and their communities, right? And I'm saying that because I think the idea of some kind of philanthropic outreach it's very limited. It's very limited. I think that it's far better for people to be very commercial, but build institutions, mobilize capital, mobilize technology into specific situations, and do it with a very strong commercial mindset, because that is going to be more sustainable. It's going to have high impact. It's going to employ Africans. Obviously you can do it in a thoughtful social impact way, environmentally friendly, community friendly, employment friendly, and so on. The Chinese are a good example in a way, because a lot of people are very critical of the Chinese. But the reality is what the Chinese are doing is opening markets, developing infrastructure. They're extracting ore and developing mines and processing plants and building the infrastructure to get things from A to B. And if they don't do that, the markets would be less developed. That's why I'm saying the model of doing that obviously must be community friendly and engaged and respect laws and regulation in the environment. But it's better to be engaged than to be talking in ivory towers without doing much.
In 2013, 2014, you authored or co-authored the Goldman Sachs report, 2 Decades of Freedom, commemorating South Africa's 20-year anniversary of the democratic transition from 1994. So now it's 2025, 30 years now. What would you add on to that you see as South Africa's development since then?
It's not a pretty story what's happened since the release of that report. So the report was released in November 2013. So it's 12 years. Prior years, it averaged 3% growth rates, over 3% growth rate in South Africa's economy post-94 to 2013. Since then, the growth rate has collapsed to 1% per annum, which is below population growth rates. The GDP per capita has fallen, and the overall performance of South Africa's economy has declined. We've had monetary continued excellence, but from a fiscal side, we've had a very bleak picture, and growth side, we've had a bleak picture, and industrial development with manufacturing has been very, very challenged. So the main issue, I would say, with the Zuma years, the mismanagement of the institutions, the economy, corruption and governance, which has declined. Many of us that backed President Ramaphosa backed him because we thought he was the best available option to reverse the declines in governance Zuma had brought about through his state capture project. And I think that President Ramaphosa has done some things which have stabilized things from a bad point. But has he succeeded in turning them around? I would say the jury's out in South Africa. There are two main challenges today. The one is economic and relates to the unemployment rate. So the effective unemployment rate is 43%. People who are looking for work and cannot find it, or people who've given up looking for work and cannot find it, 43%, or roughly 12 million people. There's 17 million people working and 12 million people can't find work. That's the one problem. The other major problem is safety and security. The consequence of illegality, the idea of wrongdoing and consequence doesn't have currency in South Africa, unfortunately. So those are the two big things. We need economic growth and we need a much stronger implementation of the cycle of prosecution in South Africa.
Honestly, you could probably say the same, broadly speaking, for the major African countries, which reminds me of something you wrote, an article you wrote a few years ago, titled Africa is the Last Frontier for Global Growth. And there was one thing you said that stuck out, which is Africa's growth will hinge on the performance of its largest economies, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. So do you still believe that without the strong continuous performance of those countries, it's not possible for Africa in general to rise? And then what do you think are the implications of that, especially because some smaller countries seem to be doing well?
Look, I mean, Africa is 54 countries, which in and of itself is a legacy of colonialism. Because if you know the history of Africa, Africa's borders were effectively carved out by the colonizers about 100 years ago. And it's a false environment, actually. But if you think of Africa as a car, the engines are those three countries. Where are we today? I've talked about South Africa, a lot of challenges. Nigeria, for the first time, when I was teaching at Columbia Business School, I would say to the class that I thought that the structural reforms being undertaken by the Tinubu administration around the currency, around subsidies, and other elements of the structural makeup of the economy was the first signs that I had that this was a serious government undertaking reforms that was causing a lot of pain, but would over time effectively help Nigeria through this very difficult time. And what you've seen since then is that the currency weakened considerably, but then strengthened again. Not very much, but it has found a level which I think provides a very good basis for Nigeria to strengthen. So I actually think that there are green shoot signs of positive developments around Nigeria. And then Egypt, obviously, the naysayers would have said that Egypt was going to collapse. But actually, the government of President Sisi has kept Egypt in a relatively stable position. And whilst it has currency challenges, funding challenges, and so on, it has maintained the level. So I don't think all is lost. I think there are signs from Ethiopia, from Kenya, from Angola, from Mozambique, from Rwanda, some of the smaller countries. There are some signs, but they are mixed. Mozambique is a very good case where there's massive opportunity with this gas development in the north that has been squandered. So far, they're trying to start the process again, but through shooting themselves in the foot with terrorism in Mozambique. Unfortunately, people need to make their opportunities, take them and move them forward. And it's mixed. It's a mixed picture, I would say.
Last two questions. As someone who you've spent a lot of time of your life and your life's work across Africa, and you've also spent a good deal of time and work in the US, what would you say is the American dream? And then would you say there's an African equivalent of that? I know Africa is, like you said, broadly, it's a large number of countries, but do you think there's any broad African aspiration, united aspiration, that would be like an equivalent of that?
So, the Statue of Liberty is always, as a kid, the image of democracy and liberty in America. And it's the land of opportunity and the land of wherever you come from, you can succeed, whether you've got a limited or otherwise opportunities. Your talent will always rise to the top. That's always my image over my lifetime of America relative to South Africa. And I think my travels through Africa, whether it's Ethiopia, Nigeria, the townships of South Africa, the cities, wherever it is, it's always in my mind that the challenges in Africa are immense, particularly for people on the ground who have very little. But there's an entrepreneurial and cultural spirit that is tremendously strong. And that spirit, I think, is our greatest hope. The talent and the spirit of the people of resilience in Africa to fight against all of the negatives, corruption and poor governance and bad institutions and broken promises, particularly the youth are fighting for their opportunities. The idea of an African Union, one African currency is very powerful. And Gaddafi was the person that most championed that many years ago. I think that if you look back, President Mbeki and Obasanjo, that moment when they were both respective presidents of their countries, Africa was at its height in terms of momentum, leadership, trying to push things forward. If you bring that all together, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the development of that institution is critical. I mean, when we talk at the Columbia Business School about bringing into play of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement as a practical measure to bring about free movement of goods, people, and so on throughout Africa, creating a market that is viable, like Europe is a viable market, the EU with one currency, creating a market that is viable for all other economies, the United States, China, and others, to trade into, build capacity for distribution of those goods into Africa. It's a very powerful idea. And that's, to me, the core of what we need to see. We need to see the AFCT as an institution, but also the countries giving life to that reality of Africa being a single market, a movement of people and goods and services. It needs to be a win-win environment in which your success is my success. Because you're benefiting, I'm going to benefit, and Africa as a whole will rise together, not at the cost of this country or that country.
Final question. In early 2022, father passed away, unfortunately. Before then, your parents received national honors for the work that we talked about, their activism and helping to bring about the end of apartheid in their own way. And for yourself, you talked about being 62, you're turning 63. You have your own family, your own 4 children. What do you want to be your legacy, both in terms of your own family, but also what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want to have been your impact?
So as I said to you, I think that, I've probably got 15 years of still very productive, perhaps the most productive years of my career left before I can I can take a rest. In 15 years, I would hope that this country can turn the positive corner. There's some people that see our decline as irreversible. We must acknowledge that, and we must turn it around. And we have to turn it around through good governance, through political engagement, and through going back to this question of putting the best people in the positions, putting meritocracy above national differences. That's number one. Number two, we really need to try and build Africa and build its impact and get away from narrow-minded leadership. We need leadership in Africa that is really serious about building the continent and building the institutions that can carry the next generations, because we are going to have a major problem in the world. And the world, if we don't succeed, is going to experience the strife and the reactions we talked about of the rise in right-wing populism around the world in reaction to Africa's inability to meet its development goals. So I think those are the three things that I would focus on. I'm very anxious and I'm relaxed at the same time. I'm anxious because I see so much that is going in the wrong direction. I'm relaxed because I see my children and that generation full of talent, full of opportunity and fresh energy. Don't lose your energy. It's very important that you're at the beginning of your careers, you double down. And my last message is have conviction. Whatever you decide, don't be meek and mild about your decision. You have to dig deep, make it happen, have conviction about your belief system. Don't go into things half-hearted. And because of the power of the skills that you represent, if you go in with conviction, you are more likely to succeed. And that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Colin. And thank you for that last bit of advice. Thank you so much for your time and for your words and for your warmth.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching. I really, really hope you found that helpful and inspiring. Don't forget to check out the links below. Like, subscribe, share with anyone else you think would find this helpful. And yeah, see you in the next episode. Bye.